Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Robert Seiden-Schwartz, or Bob. I'm the president for the Montana World Affairs Council. My privilege today to be here with you and our esteemed group of presenters for a discussion on Russia, Putin, and all things Middle East Caucasus and Ukraine. So I'd like to introduce, who will also be our first presenter, Dr. Robert Green, who is the Department Chair, University of Montana History. And sitting next to him is Mike Mayer, University of Montana History Department. And then, of course, Mehrdad Kia, who's the chair for the Central Asian Southwest Studies program and responsible for the program that we have here today. So to all of you, I say welcome. Yes. We have an awful lot to cover as the country geographically is such an immense country. Also, the discussion today will equal that too. Just a few quick comments. How many people were here last night when Senator Tester presented? Great. He mentioned something that for me is very significant that goes to the heart of why this conference and why you're here today, an informed public. He had said that. I wish he would have expanded upon that a little bit more. But as you come here today, not just for your own interest edification or classroom requirement, as it may be, but when you leave, I really want you to think about what do you take away? And not just, of course, the information that's going to be shared by our presenters, but as citizens. That is the difference maker. So as we will discuss, as we will present, I want you all to be thinking about what you have taken away from this and how you help move that needle as voters, as people that are engaged. You know, I've been doing this for several years, and in some cases, I take for granted the excellence and expertise that's being presented here today. But what I don't take for granted is the individuals and time and effort that they have made to travel from far distances and here within our own community to bring to you their insights, their expertise, and what they're willing to share to help us as citizens of Missoula, Montana, and this country. So as I take maybe for granted the expertise and excellence that is always a part of this program, I will not take for granted the effort that these people make by coming here today to share their time and expertise and to engage with us as citizens. So thank you very much, and I'd like to introduce, save the applause for Mr. Green, please. Dr. Green, you're on.
Good afternoon. Thanks for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. Is this working in the back? Can everybody hear me? Okay, fantastic. So to talk about Russian foreign policy today, and I should preface my remarks by saying that I'm sort of a historian of Russian culture and religion in the 19th and 20th century, so I'm not a foreign policy expert by any stretch of the imagination. But in speaking of Russian foreign policy today, I think it's impossible to do so without speaking of its chief architect and executor, the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Since he catapulted onto the world stage in 2000, Putin has captivated Russia watchers, both professionals and amateurs alike, with his shadowy past, his cloak and dagger, Cold War persona, KGB ties, steely gaze, tiger wrestling skills. Putin has managed to prove this sort of endlessly fascinating figure for analysis and speculation. Every gesture he makes, every pithy aphorism that falls from his lips is scrutinized and re-scrutinized for meaning. So we've entered, in many ways, I think, a new era of Kremlinology. And those of you who remember the Cold War will likely remember this idea of Kremlinology, the likes of which we haven't seen since the days of the old hammer and sickle. Now, as then, Western observers try to glean meaning and significance about Russian politics on the basis of whatever incomplete information is available to us. What does Putin want? What is he up to? Does he desire peace? Does he want war? What are Putin's intentions vis-a-vis the West? How do we make sense of Putin and his policies. And I think this kind of fascination with Putin himself goes beyond simple kind of palace intrigue and courtly gossip. I think it matters because in the Russian presidential system today, so much power is vested constitutionally and sort of extra legally, but realistically as well, in the person of the presidency, in Putin's hands. So what follows in my brief remarks this afternoon is an attempt to kind of sketch out some rough sense of what I think is informing Putin's foreign policy, a policy that I would describe as reactive, indeed reactionary. Putin is a nationalist first and foremost, and this I think is one of the keys to understanding Putin. And his commitment to nationalism and the cause of Russian nationalism in an increasingly globalist, ostensibly borderless age sets him apart from most other world leaders in power, not from current trends, I think, towards nationalism in Central and Eastern Europe, but at least those in power, nominally, in the West. As president, Putin has also harnessed the full power of the Russian state, which he uses as a mechanism to keep society in check as needed. In Putin's illiberal system, the state exists not to safeguard individual rights, but to monitor and, if need be, censor individual expression, public morals, broadly conceived, and political speech and action. Putin is also a genuinely pious man. I'm about to say something very impious. I'll just do this. Putin portrays himself as a good Orthodox Christian, and he plays this role to the hilt in his public performances. I don't think this is a purely cynical ploy either. Some have read his very performative orthodoxy as such, but I think it's genuine. And Putin has taken great pains to associate his political sovereignty, his right to rule, as president with the moral sanction of the Russian Orthodox Church. Following his most recent inauguration in 2012, Putin attended a church service in the Moscow Kremlin. The chief celebrant was the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church himself, Kirill, seen here in the green vestments on the left. And the church brought out for the occasion the 12th century icon of the Vladimir Mother of God, one of the most sacred objects in Russian culture. The same icon, not coincidentally, brought out to bless the czars at their coronations in centuries past. So if we're searching for an historical archetype or antecedent that allows us to get a grasp on Putin, to get into his head to see what makes him tick, I'd suggest that rather than see Putin as Stalin, the most commonly encountered comparison, I think, in the global media today, as this poster suggests, hail to the great Stalin, changed hail to the great Putin. Rather than see Putin as Stalin, I think a more fruitful analogy is between Putin and the 19th century Russian Emperor Nicholas I. Like Nicholas, Putin has sought to control the contours of public conversation in Russia today through such familiar Nikolaevan means as state-controlled media, active and intrusive censorship, and government-sponsored efforts to shape and mold public opinion through institutions like the public school curriculum, textbooks, and standards. Like Nicholas, Putin has taken aim at particularly prominent targets who have publicly crossed him or defied his will. Alexander Litvinenko, victim of polonium poisoning, Boris Berezovsky, hounded into exile, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, arrested, Anna Politkovskaya, murdered, the activists of Pussy Riot, arrested, tried, literally sent to Siberia. And like Nicholas, Putin has sought to push further into Central Asia to bolster what he sees as a legitimately Russian sphere of influence in the region. Like Nicholas, Putin has declared himself the protector of Orthodox Christian populations abroad across the Near East. So Russia's historic and strategic interest in Syria is a long-standing one. And like Nicholas, too, Putin has shown an inordinate interest in the Crimean Peninsula and seems willing to fight to keep it if needed. Putin, like Tsar Nicholas and the rest of the Romanovs, exhibits this very complicated attitude toward the West and toward all things Western, picking and choosing what he likes and ignoring the rest, seeking all the benefits and advantages of Western technology, modernization, without the messiness that necessarily accompanies that, the rule of law, separation of powers, guarantee and preservation of individual rights. So the West, I think, figures in Putin's imagination, as it did for Russian nationalists in the 18th and 19th century, Tsar Nicholas not least among them. The West figures as a kind of elusive other, an ever-shifting set of values and ideals whose one constant is that it, the West, stands in opposition to the qualities and morals that Russia holds dear and that makes Russia unique, changing over time, but often associated with tradition over innovation, collectivism over individualism, spirituality, soulfulness over materialism and secularism. This attitude toward the West as something both alluring and threatening, helps to inform Putin's foreign policy. The Russia expert Walter LaCour, in his recent book Putinism, diagnoses Putin and his Kremlin entourage as suffering from an acute case of Zapadophobia, which means fear of the West. And the symptoms of this political malady seem obvious enough, but LaCour kind of belabors it a little bit, the medical metaphor, to try and determine the root causes of the patient's condition. And no small part of Putin's Zapadophobia, Western phobia, lies, I would suggest, in the simple but unpleasant truth that the leading Western power, the United States government, has broken virtually every promise and pledge it has made to Russia since 1990. And that after a quarter century of this, the image of the West has lost some of its luster in the eyes of Russian political leaders. My apologies to Russian speakers for the crudity of this cartoon, but this admittedly crass image kind of makes this point. This is a widely circulated Russian cartoon, circulated widely online in the Russian blogosphere. We see, of course, it needs little dissection, I think, but we see a seated Uncle Sam smiling and choosing from a bountiful selection of toilet paper rolls which read UN resolution, the UN Charter, international law, the Human Rights Charter, right, a commentary through Russian eyes of the low regard that the West has for these scraps of paper and the figurative ends to which the West will put them. The caption describes Uncle Sam not as a Democrat, but as a dermocrat, which is a pun, again, crude, on the urgent need that brought Uncle Sam to this pass in the first place. The trash can reads peace. So it's not subtle, but you have to admit it's somewhat effective. The main sticking point for Putin, as it had been for Nicholas I in the 1830s and 40s, is this perception that Western alliances are expanding into and encroaching on what Russia perceives and has declared to be its rightful sphere of influence. And for Putin, the principal bugbear here, of course, is NATO. In 1990, during the presidency of George H.W. Bush, U.S. Secretary of State James Baker assured Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO forces would not move 1 inch to the east, provided that the Soviets agreed to allow a unified Germany to join NATO. Once made, this assurance was promptly forgotten or ignored. When President Bill Clinton ran for re-election in 1996, he pledged that NATO would, quote, reach out to all the new democracies in Central Europe, the Baltics, the new independent states of the former Soviet Union. Clinton promised that, quote, NATO will promote greater stability in Europe. And he hastened to assure the Russian President, Boris Yeltsin, that Russia had nothing whatsoever to fear from NATO's eastward expansion. Now, Yeltsin evinced little public concern about NATO. His interests largely lay elsewhere. Where exactly, I have no idea. But Putin and the men who were to become part of his close circle of advisors did care. And this is part of a generational shift, I think, taking place at the end of the 80s into the 90s. Putin and his future allies of today were young men in the 90s. Putin himself, of course, was stationed as a KGB chief in Dresden, East Germany. His future defense minister, Sergei Ivanov, was a KGB operative at the Soviet embassy, or Russian embassy later, in Helsinki. They watched as NATO forces intervened in the Bosnian Civil War and engaged with Serbian forces allied with Russia. And in the war's aftermath, they watched as NATO continued to creep eastward, inch by inch, in contravention of Baker's pledge. And as this map shows, NATO has expanded dramatically since 1990. It currently includes not only past member countries of the Warsaw Pact, like the former Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, but even former Soviet republics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. So, since the ostensible end of the Cold War a quarter century ago, NATO, true to Baker's word, hasn't moved an inch eastward. It's moved hundreds of miles eastward, up to the very borders of the Russian Federation. Many in the Kremlin, Putin I think included, fear that Ukraine will be the next domino to fall. Last year, Ukrainian President Poroshenko declared that he intended to put the question of NATO membership to a referendum. And early polls, indicate that it would likely be approved by Ukrainian voters, particularly voters in the West, the western part of Ukraine. The former Soviet Republic of Georgia, too, has been eagerly pursuing NATO membership for some years, which was an underlying, very real factor in the Russo-Georgian War of 2008. So the advance of NATO appears to belie all of the West's repeated public assurances that the motives of NATO members are purely defensive and aimed at preserving regional stability. The spread of NATO has the, I think, unintended consequence of playing completely into the hands of nationalist politicians like Putin, who have simply to point to maps like this to show Russian voters that they, the West, are pushing back upon our very borders, threatening our sphere of influence. In December, the Speaker of the State Duma, Sergei Naryshkin, a boyhood friend and now close political ally of Putin, Sergei Naryshkin described NATO rather memorably as a cancerous tumor on the European continent, one that should be dissolved for the greater good and stability of Europe. So from the Russian perspective, the march of NATO cannot help but be seen, I think, in familiar terms of encroachment, encirclement, and isolation, fears that harken back to the coldest days of the Cold War, but which in fact go back beyond that into Russia's imperial past. Let me show you here. The Russian bear, shown as a summer cottager tending his dacha garden, he eyes warily the incursion of these western weeds, conveniently emblazoned with a NATO flag, that are closing in on his private plot. And the bear is prepared to put down his paper and pick up the axe or hoe here and chop them up and discard them onto the compost heap, as we can see he's done time and again in centuries past when threatened with invasive species from the West. Now, if we look at just a few very quickly sort of Western depictions of the Russian bear as aggressor, instigator, swatting at neighboring hives, Crimea, Georgia has already fallen here, or mauling the Ukrainian borderlands, there are thousands of Western images like this, showing Russia's foreign policy as essentially aggressive, essentially predatory. But again, the self-representation that we find in the Russian media today takes a very different story. Russia as the sort of reluctant warrior. Russia's hand is being forced. Russia as victim. The victim or object of Western and Far Eastern machinations, as you see in this contemporary Russian cartoon. Right? The idea is that it's either fight back or be carved up. Putin's domestic and foreign policy is based on the promise of making Russia great again, which sounds familiar, restoring Russia to its rightful place as a regional and global superpower. And so Putin bristles with indignation at the expansion of a Western alliance system, NATO, that not only pointedly leaves him out, but whose sole reason for being in the post-Cold War era seems, from his perspective, to be based on the principle of excluding Russia from the table of nations. So pushing Putin further and further into a corner may trigger a bellicose response from the Russian president. If we, just to conclude, go back to this comparison between Putin and Nicholas I, back in the 1850s, indignant that the Western powers had isolated him, excluded him, backed him into a corner, Nicholas I found himself fighting Britain, France, and Turkey in the Crimean War. Whether Russia will square off against the West in a sort of Crimean War Redux 2.0 remains to be seen. I'd venture to guess it's doubtful. But continuing to quarantine this restless patient while assuring him that this isolation is in the best interests of regional security will not, I would suggest, cure Putin or his policies of their Western phobia. Thank you.
ask Dr. Green just to stay for a moment. There's a question I want him to elaborate on for the benefit of the audience, which is, as you're listening to this, there's something also very deep at play here, which is, who are the Russians? Deep in the soul of the Russian people, in terms of appealing to the culture and nationalism, there is nothing new about what's happening now. This goes back to the time of the czars and before then. Would you please give the audience some insight into how modern Putin and government uses and appeals to that culture and nationalism, particularly as it relates to policy issues?
Yeah, sure. Do you want me to answer that now, or should we continue
please,
with the
if you
panel?
would.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I don't want to suggest that Putin is simply a kind of pre-modern vestige or leftover of a 19th century kind of imperial past. I think there's very real ways in which Putin has shown himself to be an sort of preeminently modern politician. His use of media, his sort of classic 20th century, now in the 21st century, sort of demagoguery. But I think that, like all nationalists, this appeal to a semi-mythical national past is a very powerful rhetorical device, and one that Putin is fond of playing again and again. But I'd be happy to elaborate on that in response to some questions, or maybe in response to what we hear here. But
I just wanted the
yeah.
audience to be thinking about that
Sure.
in relation to this conversation.
Great, thanks.
Sure. Dr. Mayer?
Thank you. Goodness, what's this? I like the big glowering image of Putin best. Yeah, that might be a good place to start. My job today, I'm told, is to talk about the relationship between the United States and Russia. And like Rob, I'm a little bit out of my main area of specialization, which is post-World War II American sort of political and cultural and social history. But I think a lot of what I plan to say builds on what Rob had said, and so I guess I'll go ahead. As a candidate in 2008, Barack Obama argued that George Bush had been too confrontational with Putin, and he called for a reset with Russia. He won the election, assumed office, and the reset began on the wrong foot. In March of 2009, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton presented the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, with a gift. It was a red button. Remember those Staples commercials with the reset button? It was a red button that said reset in English and Peregrushka in Russian. Lavrov pointed out that Peregrushka meant overcharged. I think that was symbolic of the carelessness and the muddle-headed approach of much of this administration's relationship with Russia and with Putin. In the summer of 2009, the Europeans were concerned about the prospects of a Russian invasion elsewhere because Russia had gone into Georgia the summer before. They were concerned about the new administration's position. And in an open letter to Obama, 9 former leaders of European Union states wrote, "There is nervousness in our capitals." They wrote, "NATO today seems weaker than when we joined." And they wrote, "Russia is back as a revisionist power pursuing a 19th century agenda." In July of 2009, Obama made a trip to Russia and gave a speech to the graduates of Moscow's new economic school. He urged Moscow to stop seeing the United States as an adversary. He said assumptions that Russia and the United States were eternal antagonists was, quote, a 20th century view. It was, quote, rooted in the past. He said, in 2009, a great power does not show strength by dominating or demonizing other countries. The days when empires could treat sovereign states as pieces on a chessboard are over. And yet, at the same time, he said the United States would not tolerate another Russian invasion of Georgia. He rejected the claim that Russia had, quote, privileged interests in the former republics, and he reaffirmed American support for the sovereignty of Georgia and Ukraine. He said they had a right to choose their own foreign policy and a right to join NATO if they wanted. Even before that trip, Obama had been talking about Putin as having one foot in the past. But nevertheless, in September of 2009, Obama halted the deployment of U.S. missile defense in Europe in the hopes that it would lead to better relations with Russia. That system, incidentally, was designed to protect against a strike from Iran, not from Russia, but Russia saw that system as a threat. The decision to cancel this did not exactly thrill leaders of Poland and Czechoslovakia, who'd already agreed to host this anti-missile defense. Putin responded to Obama's overture by refusing to cooperate with sanctions against Iran and by testing a new and more sophisticated missile. So even if the administration did, in fact, have a cheaper, quicker approach to missile defense available, which is what they said, it would have made sense, it seems to me at least, to get something for withdrawing that system. The Russians hated it, and it seemingly might well have been willing to give up something for it. But I think Obama, as so many American presidents in the past, Franklin Roosevelt and others have been, was absolutely convinced of his ability to charm people. Curiously enough, Putin seems completely oblivious to Obama's charm. In March of 2012, in a meeting in Seoul, South Korea, a meeting with then-President Dmitry Medvedev of Russia, one of the big sticking points was Russian objections to American plans for a missile defense system based in Europe. And in the lull in the proceedings, Obama leaned in and quietly told Medvedev, on all these issues, but particularly missile defense, this can be solved, but it's important for him to give me space. Medvedev said, yeah, I understand. Obama said, this is my last election. After my election, I have more flexibility. Medvedev said, I understand. I will transmit this information to Vladimir. It was caught on an open mic, and ABC recorded it. In the campaign later that year, the campaign of 2012, Obama, in a debate with Romney, mocked Romney for saying that Russia was, quote, without question, our #1 geopolitical foe. Obama quipped, the 1980s are now calling and asking for their foreign policy back. Obama explained, quote, the Cold War has been over for 20 years. Obama won re-election. But then in June 2013, Edward Snowden wound up in a transit lounge in an airport in Moscow, and after weeks of negotiation, on August 1st, Russia granted temporary asylum. Obama responded by canceling a meeting with Putin after the Group of 20 meeting in St. Petersburg, and in August 2014, Russia extended Snowden's residency permit. One of the striking things about this dysfunctional relationship is that Putin has taken every possible opportunity to humiliate Obama. Obama's kind of like the high school geek with big ears, and Putin's kind of like the high school bully who just can't contain himself when it comes to picking on the geek. The New York Times lead for the story on the initial grant of asylum read, brushing aside pleas from President Obama and other senior Americans, Russia granted Snowden temporary asylum. Which takes us, I think, to Obama's famous red line in Syria. That line turned out to be not quite so red and not even really much of a line. In September 2013, a CBS reporter asked John Kerry if there was anything Assad could do to prevent an attack from the United States. Kerry said he could turn over every single bit of his chemical weapons to the international community in the next week. Putin immediately jumped on the opportunity and offered to get Syria to turn over its chemical weapons if the United States would reject the use of force. Assad subsequently dragged his feet a bit. He used chemical weapons, including chlorine, that were not on the list of declared weapons, but in June of 2014, Assad turned over his declared chemical weapons. In February of 2014, just 5 days before Russia invaded the Ukraine, the National Security Advisor, then National Security Advisor Susan Rice, appeared on Meet the Press and shrugged off the suggestions that Russia was preparing for any kind of military intervention. She said such thinking was, quote, a return to a Cold War construct. She said such thinking was long out of date and doesn't reflect the realities of the 21st century. I think that's a remarkable instance of pretending that the world is what the administration thought it should be, rather than viewing the world as it in fact was. In March, just after the Ukrainian Revolution, little green men appeared on the Crimean Peninsula. When Russia invaded the Ukraine, administration officials said it was, quote, not an invasion. It was an uncontested arrival. Euphemism can't alter reality. In the fantasy world of American policymakers, the attack at Fort Hood was workplace violence. The Christmas Day bomber was an isolated extremist, and attacks on U.S. diplomatic installations in Benghazi were spontaneous reactions to a YouTube video. Soon after the invasion of Russia, Obama declared that Russia was, quote, on the wrong side of history. It's really, I think, a revealing statement. I think he really believes that history moves in a linear direction, and that he knows what that direction is. He's fond of saying that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice. But in response to that, one can't help but be at least tempted to paraphrase Stalin and ask how many divisions justice has. With Russia, in effect, in control of Crimea, Putin held a press conference which was really surprising, and maybe Rob can comment on this, but it seemed disjointed. He made apparently contradictory statements. He said there were no Russian troops in the Ukraine. Obama saw that as an opportunity to give Putin what he called an off-ramp. At the same time, he warned that the United States would isolate Russia if it grabbed more land. And Russia did face sanctions and expulsion from the G8, but the fact is Russia is the world's 8th largest economy. It's not so easy to isolate Russia. India and China weren't going to cooperate. The Europeans weren't willing to go very far. And the situation wound up being very similar to the Red Line in Syria. It was a rhetorical position that the American administration was unwilling or unable to back up with action. Russia went ahead and annexed the Crimea on March 18, 2014. It was, in fact, a throwback to the 19th century. In March, on March 24th, Obama said, "The United States does not view Europe as a battleground between East and West, nor do we see the situation in Ukraine as a zero-sum game. That's the kind of thinking that should have ended with the Cold War." Obama decreed such thinking passé, out of fashion. Didn't seem to bother Putin in the least. On March 25th, Obama said Russia's a regional power that is threatening some of its immediate neighbors, not out of strength but out of weakness. He admitted that the annexation of Crimea would be difficult to reverse, but he made it clear that while the Western nations were not contemplating a military response, at least not unless Putin invaded another NATO nation, member nation, it was a curious mixed signal. Russia moved into the eastern Ukraine. Obama has said repeatedly that this is not a new Cold War, and I think he's largely correct in that regard, but the situation isn't entirely unfamiliar either, as Rob has explained. The New York Times reported in April of 2014 that Obama was spending a great deal of time on the Ukraine, but, quote, it did not seem to absorb him. I think by this time Obama came to the conclusion that he was not likely going to have a very constructive relationship with Putin, and he focused instead on attempting to minimize the disruption that Putin could cause. And yet, again, things seem to have worked in a curious way. In September 2014, 2 days after Obama visited Estonia to symbolize America's commitment to that nation's security, Russian agents entered Estonia, kidnapped an Estonian security official, and after a closed trial, sentenced him to 15 years. The Baltic states in particular, as Rob pointed out, but also Russia's neighbors, worried about what Putin's next move might be. And there really were some serious strategic concerns here. What would happen if Russia moved into Estonia? Often the claims are that there's an ethnic minority, a Russian-speaking minority. Well, there is in Estonia, and the Estonians were worried. And Estonia is a member of NATO. What would happen if Russia did move into Estonia, which seems at this point not terribly likely? But what would happen if if Russia did move in and NATO did not respond? It would effectively vitiate Article 5 of the NATO treaty, which is that an attack on one is an attack on all. By 2015, the American administration's position had changed considerably. Obama's own choice for chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff declared, quote, Russia represents the greatest threat to our national security. Ray Odierno, the outgoing Army Chief of Staff, called Russia, quote, America's most dangerous military threat. Obama's own Secretary of Defense said Russia poses an existential threat to the United States. Apparently, 2015 was calling and wanted the 1980s foreign policy back. Finally, there's Syria. In 2015, Russia built up an air base at Latakia province, which served as a complement to its long-standing naval base at Tartus. I think the Obama administration was caught somewhat off guard by this. Kerry said that Russia's new assets were for, quote, force protection. But then on September 30th, 2015, a Russian general walked into the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad and announced that Russian jets would soon begin airstrikes in Syria and basically warned the United States to stay out of the way. Russia said that they would target ISIS. Kerry said, we're prepared to welcome those efforts, but Russian forces did not limit their attacks on ISIS or even focus on ISIS. They attacked opponents of the Assad regime, including those elements supported by the United States. Obama touted his U.S.-led coalition of 65 countries, very few of which actually contribute anything to the war against ISIS. He dismissed the support of Assad by Russia and Iran as, quote, a coalition of two. He said that Russia was doomed to fail in Syria, but I think that missed the point. Russia wasn't trying to reconquer the entire country for Assad. Russia was rather trying to consolidate Assad's hold on the Alawite areas, which include Latakia and Tartus. On September 15th, Obama told the UN, in today's world, the measure of strength is no longer defined by control of territory. Really? This month, Putin abruptly announced that he was withdrawing most Russian troops from Syria. He said the intervention had achieved its objective. And I think basically he's right. They stabilized Assad's regime. He's probably not going to rule what used to be all of Syria again, but he's in reasonably good shape in his own areas, which is really, I think, all that Russia wanted. Putin made it very clear he was going to keep the air base at Latakia, the naval base at Tartus. And I think this leads us to an interesting difference. I think Rob correctly portrayed Putin as a nationalist. Obama has repeatedly assured us that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice. I think Putin has a different agenda. Channeling his inner Stalin, he asks how many divisions justice has, and then acts accordingly. Thank you.
Michael, thank you. I'd like to now introduce Dr. Mehrdad Kia.
Good afternoon. The focus of the brilliant analysis presented by my two very good colleagues, Professor Robert Greene and Professor Michael Mayer, was Russia more or less in the West. And today, right now, I will take you to the Russia's Orient, right, to the East, where usually the US media is quite silent about it. Because we know Europe, but we still refer to those 5 republics as the 5 Istans. We still refuse to learn their names. God forbids if we ever forget to pronounce Poland, but Kazakhstan, that's very difficult to pronounce and remember. So it's a little bit interesting, you know, how the West is always so much more important than Europe, of course, is the main theater. So what I will talk about, especially because our colleague Milena Oganessian is sick and cannot be here, and I have to combine the 2 presentations, I will start with Central Asia and the Caucasus, which is basically Milena's presentation, and then I will move to the Middle East, which was my presentation, and combine them. But I will distinguish several regions, and first and foremost, we will start with Central Asia. By Central Asia, of course, in this case, I do not mean Western China, which is also part of Central Asia, but the 5 former Soviet republics of Central Asia. And in order to remember their names, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and Tajikistan. 4 of them, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Kyrgyzstan, are principally or overwhelmingly Turkic-speaking former Soviet republics. The one, Tajikistan, is primarily a Tajik, Persian, Iranian-speaking sort of republic. So from the very beginning, this map represents Soviet political engineering. None of these existed, of course, prior to 1920s. All of these countries are the work and the design of a ruler and a pencil used in Moscow to draw new countries, and none of them really correspond with exact national entities. When I say Kazakhstan, it does not mean that everybody in Kazakhstan is actually Kazakh. In fact, Kazakhstan, let's start there, was formed, and by the way, all except one, Kyrgyzstan, are run still by former Soviet communist bosses. They are all very good friends and buddies of Mr. Putin. And this is a very key issue for us in terms of understanding Russian influence. But all of these are artificial entities. And I think this is the ABC of understanding, because always people say, why is it such a mess over there? Well, it is a mess because people were never allowed to form their own countries, and somebody else created these countries artificially for them. And in the case of course, the 5 Soviet republics, starting with Kazakhstan, you will understand that the countries were actually created in order to have a non-viable state. In fact, the entire meaning of these republics was to create economies, political systems that were completely loyal to Moscow, but at the same time would never form a nation, a homogeneous nation with one national identity, with one language, one religion, one sense of unified national sense of itself. And of course, the largest in terms of territory is Kazakhstan. And why is Kazakhstan so important today? Is of course because still roughly 37% of its population is Russian. And because of the heavy presence of a Russian population, mostly in northern and northwestern part of Kazakhstan, it is an area where Russian influence is expanding again, thanks to the presence of the Russian population. But Kazakhstan is also very important because Kazakhstan has petroleum and gas, and very, very large amount of petroleum and gas. And I'm sure my friend Bob would talk about the importance of petroleum and gas in his presentation. And before the Kazakhs decide to ship this oil and gas through China to world markets, Russia has to be there to make sure that China does not enter the Central Asian markets as a competitor or as a competition. So today, the Russian population is used to expand Russian influence, but Russian economic policy is to build pipelines and encourage the Kazakhs to export their gas and oil not eastward, but westward through Russia again, making Kazakhstan once again dependent on Russia. The second one, the largest in terms of population, is Uzbekistan, which is run by one of the most brutal dictators in the world. And we don't hear about him. We don't hear about all the torture methods he has invented during his long reign. This is Islam Karimov, right? For a very short time, our friend and ally, right? Because when 9/11 happened and we needed sort of flying rights over his territory, we negotiated with him, and for several years he became our ally in the war against Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. This man is also a very close friend of Mr. Putin, and this is the man who actually kicked out the Americans and the British and the French when they criticized his very harsh repression of anti-government demonstrators in 2005. In 2005, in a matter of an hour, he killed over 2,000 of his citizens who were demonstrating for freedom, jobs, and equality of women and men, things that you cannot speak of in Uzbekistan freely and openly. And of course, the next, which is fascinating because it's one of the largest gas-producing countries in the world today, is Turkmenistan. Just northeast of Iran, south of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. It's a desert country, this one. not too many camels, don't worry about it, I will not bore you with the images, but a very rich country of about 4 to 5 million people. And Turkmenistan now is building pipelines once again. It's again the issue of where the gas and oil will be exported from Central Asia. The key to understanding Central Asia is that all 5 republics are landlocked, and they have to go through a second or third country to export their goods to the outside world. And the Turkmens are using either Iran to ship their gas out through the Persian Gulf or through Kazakhstan and Russia in order to export their oil and gas. And finally, the only non-communist boss, Kyrgyz Republic of Almazbek Alambayev, who is actually a former non-communist, actually a professor himself. And this is the only country in Central Asia which actually allowed the United States to have a base. This is a very important air base that the United States used in order to supply US and NATO troops in Afghanistan. But since then, that base has been closed and it has been replaced by a Russian base. The Russians have reestablished their military presence in Kyrgyzstan, and the way they did it was simply demanding that no American presence would be tolerated on the ground and that they would pay more money to the Kyrgyz to shut down the US base so they can open the Russian base. My brother and colleague, Dr. Ardikia, and I, we passed that base one time, and it's interesting. You wonder what is going on in a Russian base. There is a Russian soldier with a Russian uniform and a very old gun, and he was just smoking. So in some ways, when you look at Russian presence in Central Asia, it's once again, as Rob and Mike were talking about, it's at the level, of course, of symbolic that the Russians are back, but what kind of military might they have brought to Kyrgyzstan? Not much, at least not seen by those who can visit the country. Last but not least, of course, the only Persian-speaking republic, this is the Republic of Tajikistan. Tajik is actually a name that the Russians invented in order not to call Tajikistan Iranistan, because basically the language, the culture, and the history of the people is exactly as Persian as Afghanistan and Iran. In fact, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, and Iran sort of form a union in terms of language, culture, and history. But the word Tajik is used to sort of make a distinction between the Persian speakers in Central Asia and the Persian speakers in Afghanistan and Iran. This man, whom we have had the honor of meeting in person, Imam Ali Rahmanov, now he has dropped the Uv and he has just Imam Ali Rahman to make it more Persian sounding rather than Russian sounding. He's a very interesting, he's a former wrestler and he is actually a former member of the Communist Party. He's a very close friend of Putin, and he is creating a sort of balance for himself. He enjoys a very close relationship with Russia, the Russian embassy, and this is how you see it in Central Asia. The power which has the most power and influence in the country has the largest embassy. The Russians have 2 towers, basically. United States just have 1 building. Iran has 3 towers next to it. China has a magnificent embassy, and so on and so forth. But he has struck an understanding with the Russians. He has allowed Russian troops to stay in Tajikistan because Tajikistan has a common border with Afghanistan. And the fear of the return of Taliban is very real. And the Tajiks have therefore allowed Russian troops to be stationed on their territory. But at the same time, Rahmanov has also established a very close tie with China, a very close tie with Iran, and a very close tie with the Arab countries of the Middle East. So the Tajiks are sort of trying to play the balancing game, but you cannot escape the fact that the Russians remain the supreme power in Tajikistan, the fifth Central Asian republics, as we have been talking about. So Central Asia is considered to be more or less part of the Russian sphere of influence, to be part of the Russian Empire. They are nominally independent as far as Moscow is concerned. They now have their own economic infrastructure. They now sign agreements with the outside world. But Russia would not allow United States, would not allow European Union, would not allow China to become the supreme power there. They would allow limited relationship between these five republics and the major powers in the region, China to the east, Iran and Turkey to the south, and European Union and United States, but they would never allow these forces to become as dominant as Russia once was. Now, this is a very interesting sort of phenomena. You see more and more China entering the Central Asian markets and economies. And this is fascinating because the first time I was in Central Asia, a good 60 to 70% of goods were all Russian made. Made in Russia, made in Russia, made in Russia, made in Russia. Now if you go to Central Asia and you go to the regular market, 70 to 80% of all products are made in China. That is, China has penetrated the Central Asian markets. The goods are cheaper. They are much more accessible in terms of shipping to Central Asia. It's next door. China has also very intelligently won significant projects, tunnel building, pipe building, construction of highways, and so on and so forth. And Chinese workers work harder than anybody else. I remember we were traveling with a delegation in Tajikistan, and there was a highway, and we asked our Tajik host, who is building this highway? Because we knew the Tajiks are not building it. They don't have the means, they don't have the technology, they don't have the money. And the answer was, it is being built by Iranians and the Chinese. The only thing, the difference is Iranians only work until 5. They have to go and have a wonderful dinner in Dushanbe. Chinese were working at midnight, hanging from the tunnels at the dim of the light, and they were trying to finish the project which the Iranians had left behind. This is how Central Asia, the game is being played. All the powers are there. Russia is watching all this unfold with some anxiety, but Russia is not willing to withdraw and allow these powers to actually replace Russia as the major power. Now I want to move to the second region from Central Asia. This is the region that we call the Caucasus, or Transcaucasus, the Transcaucasus Mountains. Caucasus is really the region west of the Caspian Sea. And by the way, Caspian Sea is not a sea. It's the largest lake in the world. It is so large that they call it a sea. It is the region west of the Caspian Sea, east of the Black Sea, north is Russia, south is Iran and Turkey. It's that very magnificently beautiful and mountainous region. And in the southern part of the Caucasus, there are 3 very important countries which we better watch very carefully because there is great deal of potential for conflict, and we have been ignoring them because, of course, once again, Europe is always in our minds, NATO is always in our minds, European Union, so on and so forth. But already the Caucasus has shown the potential for eruption, conflict, and warfare. So let us start with the Southern Caucasus countries. These 3 are Georgia, a principally Christian country, Armenia, which is again a predominantly Christian country, and Azerbaijan, which is a predominantly Muslim, but a Muslim Shia country. And the key to understanding the Caucasus is that these 3 republics are also very new in terms of their history. Southern Caucasus was also very much a territory that was fought over by the 2 empires to the south, the Ottomans and the Iranians. They always fought over the control of Southern Caucasus. It's only after 18th century and the rise of Peter, especially, that the Russians began to move. And it's only during the reign of Catherine the Great that Russian forces were actually stationed in the Caucasus. And it's in the beginning of the 19th century, during the reign of Alexander I, that finally Russia began to push the Iranians and the Turks out of the region. And by 1828, Russia had become the dominant force in the region, having replaced the Persians or the Iranians and the Turks simultaneously. Now, this region, as you can imagine, is as artificially created as Central Asia. That is, these countries, the borders and the boundaries do not reflect the national borders, the ethnic borders. They actually reflect an area of manipulation of Soviet policy in terms of making sure that these republics will not be economically viable, but they will always be in conflict with one another. And let me give you a few examples. For example, the Republic of Georgia was created. It's a very small country, 4 to 5 million. But the Russians, the Soviet government, I should say, created a country which in essence would be completely fragmented inside because of different ethnic and linguistic groups. One of the largest groups in Georgia are the Ossetians. Ossetians are not Georgians, they are not Russians, they are actually Iranian-speaking population. Ossetians refer to their country as Iranistan, which means the land of the Iranians. And there is a northern Ossetia, which is part of the Russian Federation, and there is southern Ossetia, which is an autonomous region within the Republic of Georgia. And you may wonder, why is this kind of manipulation important? The answer comes, as you can imagine, and it was mentioned both in Mike's and Robert's presentations, that when the Georgians demanded independence and in fact separated themselves from the Russian Empire, from Soviet Union, and then shortly thereafter, they began to assert their independence, and then, of course, more recently, applied for membership in the NATO and membership in the European Union. Russia had a justification to invade Georgia. And why did Russians give themselves the right to attack Georgia? It was to defend the rights of the Ossetian population, which were being discriminated against. In August of 2008, Russia invaded Georgia. And since I was in Georgia right before that, it's fascinating because United States and the NATO were actually training Georgian forces. And Georgia and European Union and United States had signed several trade agreements, commercial agreements, military training agreements. The Georgians were very proud to take us to the camps where Georgian units were being trained by US advisors. And that was absolutely no-no. This is the belly, the southern belly of the Russian Empire. American presence cannot be tolerated. And there were repeated warnings to President Saakashvili of Georgia to demand the withdrawal of US forces, and of course, he refused. And the result was the Russian invasion took place in August of 2008. And Saakashvili kept on shouting while he was eating his Thai, the famous photo, he's eating his Thai, as the Russians have invaded his country, begging United States and European Union and NATO to intervene. Of course, the answer came back from the West. This is the back door of the Russian Empire. United States and NATO will not risk a war over the small country of Georgia, especially you guys don't have any gas or oil, so why should we even bother to help you? And for that reason, and Putin, if I may add to what Robert and Mike have already talked about, it's geography, right? It is what used to be Soviet Union, but it is also always based on the calculation of where United States and NATO will not intervene or will not respond militarily. And Georgia was a clear cut of a victim, vulnerable and easy to attack and occupy and basically bully. And the Georgian forces, the same that we were training, collapsed, disintegrated very quickly. And the Georgian force that you see here, very well trained in fact, but is too small, really under-equipped, you can say, and has no chance of resisting or defending its territory against a significant Russian invasion. The casualties were extremely high. The Western media more or less just ignored it. And this is fascinating, and I have to say it. Bombs go off all the time in various cities and capitals of the Islamic world. You know, we had a major casualty with several bombs going off in Turkey by ISIS. Nobody even cared to cover it. And then you have a bomb in Belgium, and 2 bombs, in fact, in Belgium. It becomes absolute news. It's as if Turks Arabs, Pakistanis, Iranians, they are less human, right? When the bombs goes off in some Arab city or Turkish city or Iranian city or Pakistani city, it's not worth covering it every day, every hour, every minute. The same thing, I think, with Georgia. Who knows about Georgia? Who cares about Georgia? Now, if this had been one of the Baltic states, I would say, if this had been Poland, if this had been a European country, I think the reaction would have been very different. Several Georgian towns fell into the hands of the Russians. The casualties were very high, and it was only through the intervention of several European countries, including France and Great Britain, that finally the invasion stopped. And the result of this is more than 100,000 Georgian refugees who have no home, who have no town, who have no village, because the Russian authorities have not allowed them to return to their homes and villages. What Russia also did, and this is very intelligent on the part of Mr. Putin, as soon as they invade and occupy a territory like Southern Ossetia, they immediately issue Russian visas for the local and native population. With that, they create actually a legal reality on the ground. That is, Southern Ossetia is no longer really a Southern Ossetia. Of course, it has a president, it has a flag, it has a set of uniforms, but for all practical purposes, these are Russian citizens with Russian legal rights. And of course, another area that we have to watch very carefully, because the drums of war have been coming to us for the last several months, is the area of Nagorno-Karabakh. Don't worry about the word. Nagorno simply means mountainous. Karabakh is the original historical name of the region. And looking at it a little bit more carefully, you realize why it's a tinderbox. Look where it's located. Russia to the north, Armenia and Turkey to the west, Iran to the south, Azerbaijan to the east, and of course part of Georgia also coming close to it from the north. This is very important, again, to tell you why we have a crisis in the former Soviet republics. Because the manipulation was, Nagorno-Karabakh was basically a majority Armenian populated region, right? But Stalin made sure that Armenia will never have access to Nagorno-Karabakh. Nagorno-Karabakh was given to the mortal, historical, cultural, linguistic, religious enemy of Armenia, which is the Shia Muslim Azerbaijan. And therefore, an Armenian enclave was created within the boundaries of Azerbaijan. So when Soviet Union collapsed, what did the Armenians do? They immediately attacked Nagorno-Karabakh, and they seized Nagorno-Karabakh, and they pushed the Azerbaijani forces out of the Armenian enclave. Thus, the beginning of a major war with thousands of casualties between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And in all this, guess who is supporting Christian Armenia? The Russians are supporting Christian Armenia, but even more interesting, and we can talk about it in greater detail, it's the Shia Islamic Iran, which is also supporting Armenia. In fact, you can say that Putin and the Islamic regime in Iran have created a north-south axis. It's Russia, Armenia, and Iran, and of course an east-west axis, which is Azerbaijan, Georgia, Turkey, and United States. So you see this sort of emerging in the Caucasus, and people always ask, why is this sort of conflict so raw and so intense? And of course, one of the answers is, always look at what the economic value of this piece of real estate is. It is very close to the Caspian Sea. And the Caspian Sea is one of the most important supplier of petroleum, the black gold. And of course, who has, or which country has control over the petroleum or the petroleum resources of the Caspian, at least in this region, is the Republic of Azerbaijan. And Azerbaijan has signed multi-billion-dollar contracts with various Western oil companies, one of which is BP, the British Petroleum. And when the pipeline was built in order to ship the oil from the Caspian Sea out of Azerbaijan, the pipeline goes from Azerbaijan, it skips Iran, it skips Armenia, it goes through Georgia, goes over from Georgia to Turkey, and then to European and American markets, which makes Armenia, Iran, and Russia left out and excluded from being a player in the game of exporting cheap petroleum from Caspian Sea. And it is no wonder, therefore, and it's not surprising, that Mr. Putin and Serge Sargsyan, the president of Armenia, are the best of friends, of course. And they are not, they're considered in Yerevan, the joke is, the buddies who will never be separated from one another. And of course, it is not just question of oil. It is also for Mr. Putin to create a military base. Russian troops are still stationed in Armenia. With Russian troops stationed in Armenia, it means that Russia has military presence just north of the Iranian border. It has military presence just west of Azerbaijani border. It has military presence just south of the Georgian-Armenian border. So Armenia's security is paramount in the minds of Putin, not so much because of the Armenian security, but also because it provides Russia with a military base in the region. And of course, Armenia and Iran and Russia have become very close recently. And of course, Mr. Putin took the time, in fact, to travel to Iran. Yes, the Islamic Republic of Iran, led by Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, where he congratulated the coming of the Persian New Year, of course, to kind of make it all warm and fuzzy, and of course, signed several multi-billion-dollar contracts. Why were the Russians signing these multi-billion-dollar contracts? Is because they were anticipating the signing of an Iran nuclear deal with the United States and the release of frozen assets that were held basically in US and European banks. The anticipation was in Russia that somewhere between $100 to $150 billion worth of assets would be released, and as soon as these assets are released, Iran would be coming to Russia and China to purchase the most sophisticated weapons. And one of the agreements is basically Russia selling the most sophisticated weaponry to Iran. And this meeting was reinforced by a very, very warm handshake between President Putin and President Rouhani of Iran. And of course, the two are not only mad about the oil pipelines or gas pipelines in the Caucasus, they are not both committed to the security of Armenia, they are not both interested in buying and selling weaponry. They are also, and this is very important for us to understand, they are also very much interested in Syria and in the Arab world. But I have to take a short footnote. I know this one looks pretty old, and it is old, to make sure that we understand that this is a marriage of convenience. Iranians are not in love with the Russians. Russians have no interest in Iranians as a people or culture. In fact, if anything, Iranians have a deep-seated resentment against the Russians because of the Treaty of Turkmenchai in 1828, when Iran had to cede Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan of today to Russia because it was militarily humiliated and defeated by Russian forces. And the Iranians have never forgotten that they were the masters in the Caucasus, and the new empire, the new European empire from the north came and crushed them, basically, humiliated them, and took over southern Caucasus. So the resentment is still there, but it's a marriage of convenience, of course. Now, having talked about this, we have to understand that the latest deal between Moscow and Tehran has just been signed. And it has been signed for $32 billion worth of weaponry sold by Russia to Iran. This is one of the leaders of Iran's Revolutionary Guards, to my right, I think, yes, to my right, and of course the Russian military command. And this actually allows Iran to emerge as a major military power in the region. And of course, we know that some of this weaponry will end up in Syria through Iran. So Russia is not just arming Syrians directly, but they are also arming the Syrian regime, the Assad regime, through Iran. And by the way, I could not help it. I came across this. Everybody says, what is the Armenian president doing in London? Right? That's the Armenian president next to Prince Charles and his lovely wife. Because every time the British try to sign an oil deal, they have to end up being hosted. And this Prince Charles, by the way, is the same Charles of Arabia. Every time the British Petroleum wants to sign an oil deal with Azerbaijanis, with Armenians, with Iran, not lately, but with Saudis, he shows up with the national dress of that country. It's good to be a king. And, and he's very flexible in terms of, he's a very culturally diverse person, I guess. Very PC. It's very interesting. And now I understand that his next visit will be, surprise, surprise, to Baku, Azerbaijan, where the British Petroleum is going to build a new pipeline. So the Russians and the Iranians and the Armenians are quite interested and anxious about the future plans from the British Petroleum. And by the way, I couldn't help escaping this. This is him in the Libyan dress, right? This is when he went to meet with Colonel Gaddafi of Libya. And he loved the clothes, the Libyan, It's the Benghazi clothes for Prince Charles. And of course, soon after, BP signed another lucrative oil deal with the butcher of Tripoli and Benghazi, Mr. Gaddafi. So I just don't want to pick just on the Russians. The British are always there. Just to move and wrap up with the Middle East, these pipelines are the pipelines we have to watch in terms of how they impact the foreign policy. The red pipeline is the very famous or infamous Baku-Ceyhan pipeline. Baku is in Azerbaijan by the Caspian Sea. Ceyhan is in Turkey. Again, the line goes through Azerbaijan and Georgia and then goes to Turkey. More pipelines are being planned, and the way they are being planned is that there is one more line, the Baku-Supsa. This is also a direct line from Azerbaijan to Georgia, but this one does not go through Turkey. It actually goes through the Black Sea, so ships can come to the Georgian ports and ship the oil from Azerbaijan to Western markets. More and more, this is what the map is going to look like. It's going to be just major pipelines, and the green ones are the existing ones already, and the pink, whatever color that is natural gas pipelines that are basically planned to be added to this composition. Now, what I will do, I will wrap up with the Middle Eastern part of this equation, which is quite interesting. Russia and Iran have become willy-nilly allies in the battle in Syria. Iran has a very clear strategic reason for being in Syria, because its principal ally is actually not Syria, but it's a terrorist organization and an Islamist organization called Hezbollah in Lebanon. Why Iran needs Hezbollah is basically it is an organization created, armed, funded by Iran to be there just north of Israel in case Israel and Iran have ever a possibility of a clash. Hezbollah will be unleashed against Israel by the Iranians. So Iran has fought a proxy war already in 2004 by unleashing Hezbollah against Israel. So Lebanon is a key strategic asset for Iran. And how do you supply Hezbollah in Lebanon? How do you arm it? How do you finance it? How do you train Hezbollah fighters? Through Syria. Syria provides the territorial access. In return for Syria allowing Iranian Revolutionary Guards training Hezbollah fighters, of course, Iran is pouring cheap oil, gas, arms, spare parts, and now actual fighters. And what is fascinating about the Iranian involvement in Syria, something that very few people talk about, Iran has brought its own armed forces. The Revolutionary Guards units are fighting in Syria. But they have also brought Hezbollah units from Lebanon. These are Shia pro-Iranian allies. But they have added one more unit, which is quite interesting. They now have a full-fledged Afghan unit Afghan unit. This is an Afghan unit which are composed of the Hazara. These are Shia Persian-speaking units who are shipped from Afghanistan through Iran to Syria to fight with the Iranian forces. The average age of these Hazara forces is 17 to 18 years old. These are boys who are sent on the mines, who are sent as sort of vanguard of Iranian and Syrian forces as they attack ISIS or other targets. Russia, and this is the question that we have to answer, why is Russia in Syria? And I hope we can talk about it in the context of what Robert and Mike talked about. And the answer is simply because Russia is looking for any opportunity, any openness to reassert its presence as an imperial power, as a world power in the Middle East. And the Russians have been saying that the Obama administration has created the kind of foreign policy vacuum that can be filled in selected areas. Russia thinks of Syria as that vacuum that has been created. We warned, as Mike aptly pointed out, we warned, this is our line, don't cross it. Don't cross it, don't cross it. And the Russians realized the United States is not going to get involved in Syria. For that reason, they saw this as an opportunity to become involved and to arm the Assad regime. So suddenly, Russian and Iranian interests converged, and of course, the result is Russia is actively arming the Assad regime, and although they have moved some of their forces recently, as Mike also pointed out, they are maintaining their air base in Latakia. And why Latakia? Because the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad is a principally Alawite regime. The Alawites are a minority in Syria. They are centered in the Latakia region. This is the northwestern region of Syria. And the protection of the Alawite regime is based on saving Latakia for the regime. And for that reason, Russia has no plan to remove the Latakia air base. They also have no plan to remove the naval base at Tartus. So Russia has moved some of its forces out, but still remains very much engaged and involved, and has left much of the responsibility to the Iranian and Hezbollah forces who are fighting with the regime. This is how the situation looks as we speak today. The regime basically, and I completely agree with Mike in this, that Assad has managed, with support from the Russians and with support from the Iranians and Hezbollah, to actually survive. A regime which was deemed to be doomed to fail and doomed to basically disintegrate has managed to survive for nearly 6 years now. And what I agree with Mike, and we can address this, is that the Syria that the Assad regime has survived is not going to be the reconstituted Syrian state as we knew it. That state was artificially created by the French in 1920s, and it cannot be reconstituted. But what the Russian, Iranian, and the Assad regime's plan was to create a western corridor, which starts in Damascus in the south and ends in Aleppo and Latakia in the north. Right now, as we speak, a good 60% of Aleppo is now under the regime's control. And this was done by air from the Russians and on land by Iranian forces who pushed. And by the way, this Alawite regime has something very interesting about it. The rank and file soldiers are Arabs. They speak Arabic. They're Sunni Muslims. It's the commander and officers who are Alawites, meaning they come from that minority from Northwest. But most of the fighting is done actually by units which are armed as paramilitary groups. They are not officially part of the Syrian armed forces. There is actually a very interesting situation, and I'm sure you will hear about it tonight at 7 o'clock. There are units of the Syrian army which are there and stationed in certain areas, let's say in southern Syria. If Assad regime tries to move them to the fighting in the north, they will rebel. They will join the rebels. And as long as they are not attacked, they just sit there basically in southern Syria. We are keeping the territory for the regime, but we have no plan of fighting for the regime either. So the only units that will fight for the regime are the paramilitary units are the Hezbollahis brought from Lebanon by Iran, the Hazara Afghan units brought from Afghanistan by Iran, the Iranians, and then Russians from the air. That's why Syria is a mess, basically, at this point. But the reason the bombing were all in this western corridor was to make sure that Latakia, which is actually the home base of the Assad family, will not fall into the hands of ISIS, and it can be liberated, and it can be connected by highway to Damascus and eventually to Aleppo. And since Aleppo is falling, almost falling, the Russians thought, well, the rest of the job can be accomplished by the Iranians and their allies. So this is an interesting alliance. This is actually from an Iranian newspaper, Iran and Russia with Syria as the glue, bringing them together. But let us not forget that, this is the concluding remark, that there are other major powers in the region, namely Saudi Arabia and Turkey. And these two cannot be ignored. Saudi Arabia is furious with the expansion of Iranian power in the region. They oppose the overthrow of Saddam Hussein and the expansion of Iran and power and influence into Iraq. They oppose Iranian presence in Syria. They see Iran having grown by leaps and bounds in terms of power and influence. So they went with a proposal, very typical Saudi. The Saudi approach is everything has a price, and Putin must have a price. And the way they did it, they send their best politician and diplomat. This is Prince Bandar, the former ambassador to Washington. He went to Moscow on a special mission, and he asked to see Mr. Putin person to person, face to face. So what is the proposal? Before, of course, they have one of these beautiful golden necklaces. They gave one to President Obama. Of course, Putin was upset, so he gets one too. And you have to bow a little bit, and you get a nice gold, sort of necklace. And what they actually did, what they actually did was they proposed the following: that we will protect Russian assets in Syria. We will buy $25 billion worth of weaponry from Russia. This is Saudis, actually. We will make sure that we will sign new contracts for Russian construction companies, Russian businesses, with one condition, that Russia stops supporting Assad and Iran. And of course, Russians thought about it. 25 billion sounded good, but it was not high enough. So the Saudis returned home, very upset and disappointed. The plan is to go back to Moscow with even a larger proposal, maybe a more lucrative proposal. Let us wait and see what will happen. The last is Turkey. Turkey has been a thorn in Mr. Putin's side. Why? Because Turkey, like Saudi Arabia, opposes Iranian presence in Syria. Turkey, like Saudi Arabia, opposes Russian presence in Syria. Turkey considers itself, and it is, a member of the NATO. It has a very important NATO base in Incirlik in southeastern Turkey. Turkey is also very, very worried about the rise of Kurdish nationalism in northern Iraq and northern Syria. The Kurds have gained their autonomy in northern Iraq. The Kurds are gaining their autonomy in northern Syria. There are 14 million Kurds in Turkey. In fact, the majority of the Kurds in the world live in Turkey. And once the Kurds have gained their independence or autonomy in northern Iraq and in northern Syria, the Turks believe that the next will be the Kurds in Turkey, who will demand a union with their brothers and sisters in Iraq and Syria. So for that reason, they want to end this war. They want Assad out. They want Syria to be reconstituted. They want to get rid of the Iranians. They want to get rid of the Russians. And for that reason, they have warned Mr. Putin repeatedly not to fly his jet fighters over Turkish territory. And Putin, of course, ignored it. And over these warnings went until the Turks took the matter into their own hands and fired at these jet fighters and brought them down, which of course immediately resulted into retaliation from Moscow. And Erdogan's message was, Russia has not produced, and I'm paraphrasing, Russia has not produced much worth buying for the last 50 years, so we are not worried as far as economic impact on Turkey. But he cannot deny the fact that there is huge amount of Russian investment. There are a lot of Russians in Turkey having bought apartments and homes and so on and so forth. Therefore, soon there will be a compromise between the two, but of course the situation remains tense. Thank you very much for your patience.
To conclude this part, I'm going to just give, I'll be brief, because I want to spend plenty of time for questions I know will be raised here. I've been asked to speak, and we've heard a common theme throughout our discussion, throughout the presentation and Dr. Kia's presentation: oil, gas, money, economics. We cannot escape that. So imagine for a moment if by magic we were able to flip a switch and we didn't use oil, we didn't use gas, and the world now was able to run your phones, your industries, your agriculture, everything that we use today on alternative energy. What happens to the economies of the Middle East, of Iran, which I understand is not in the Middle East technically, Russia, and other countries, Nigeria, Venezuela, that are dependent upon oil and gas exports for their revenue? These countries and their economies would cease to exist. Now, that's not going to happen. Economics does not work that way. Things evolve over time, but it's not that far-fetched, and I'll come back to this. Russia today, 50% of their federal budget, 70% of export revenues, 25% of the country's GDP comes from energy export. Think about Saudi Arabia. 80% of its exports in terms of revenue, 90% of its budget comes from oil. Venezuela is not too far on the verge of economic collapse. They are also seeing massive shortages in electricity due to drought. They have some of the largest hydroelectric dams in the world, but there's a drought. You can go through the list and you will see pressing issues that are compelling today that will only get more compelling in the years to come. Current population, roughly 7 billion people. 2050, estimates are, depending on events, anywhere from 9 to 10 to 11 billion people on the planet. So we are in a battle, economically, socially, and politically, for access to resources. The most important resource today and into the future will be not oil and gas or solar, but water. So when you're looking at Central Asia, when you're talking about the different regions that our panelists have discussed today, always keep in mind there is no more important resource than water. Without it, everything else does not exist. So let's stop and think about this for a second. The Russian economy today has and is experiencing its second recession in the last several years. The Saudis and other countries in the Middle East are deathly afraid of what may happen if oil prices continue to stay down for several more years. Time will not allow to get more in-depth, but I want to bring this back to an event that happened several years ago here in the United States that had been building but was really a catalyst for where we are today. Anybody want to venture a guess what that is as it relates to oil and gas? I know you know what it is. Some of the students, raise your hand, give me an answer. Fracking. Thank you. The United States, up until that point, was producing about 5 million barrels a day. We use, depending on our economic growth, anywhere from 18 to 20 million barrels on a daily basis. So we went from 5 million barrels a day to over, at the height of our oil production, to over 10 million barrels a day. Now, we're still importing oil. People think because they've heard about the fracking and the revolution that's taking place that we're not importing oil anymore. Obviously, that's not correct. But what did it do? It changed the game. Right now, it's a very simple equation. The world is producing too much oil and not using enough. So there's this divergence in terms of anywhere from about 2 million barrels at its height to about 1.4 million barrels in terms of excess capacity right now. So there was an event that happened about 18 months ago. The Saudis, seeing the effect of this revolution that took place here in the United States in terms of bringing 5 million barrels more onto the marketplace, surprised the entire industrial and import and energy-producing world. Instead of lowering prices, instead of lowering production to increase the prices, what did they do? They kept the spigot open, and they kept production running very aggressively. And we've seen the effect of that when oil prices were at $110 a barrel. West Texas crude, I looked the other day, was at 39 bucks. Actually hit a low here of about 26 or 27. So we've seen a bit of a rebound. Now, let's think about what that does to countries that are dependent upon oil or gas for their revenues. And you heard Dr. Kia talk about Central Asia, China, Russia, various other places that are so heavily dependent upon this for their revenues and everything that comes with it. There's another thing at play here that's critical. Russia's population is in decline. It's an aging population. The mortality rate actually exceeds the birth rate. It's a severe problem. Other parts of the world, we see increasing populations in terms of youthful percentages representing that. Middle East has an overwhelming majority of their populations, including Iran, between the ages of under 30 years old. Right, 70%. The West, the U.S. is the only industrial country, when you think of the industrial nations, that actually has an increasing population. And it's not because our birth rate is so high, but immigration, which is an important component of economically and industrial what we need to be able to maintain. So the Russians are facing not only a declining population, a poor infrastructure, declining oil prices, but when you think about this and overlay that to some of the political issues that we're dealing with and some of the forays into other parts of the world, very much at the heart of this is the issue of what's happening in terms of the oil markets, the pricing, and the revenue generated from it. So you think about these young populations. What the Saudis have done here recently is Saudis have always subsidized their electricity, their gasoline, their health care, their education. It's a society that, because of their vast oil wealth, has been able to give their populace these benefits. For the first time in my memory, they've actually increased the cost of many of these goods. Now, that may not seem like an issue when you go from 14 cents a gallon to 20 cents a gallon. I mean, we went from $4 down to $2, but in a population that is overwhelmingly youthful, is used to the privilege of having a lifestyle of this type. In Saudi Arabia, most of the work is done by people coming in from the country, not the Saudis. So you start to think about this. What happens if oil prices stay low? Not just for the next several months or the next year, but for several more years, what the dislocation on the budgets of these countries is going to be, what the issue politically will be. Remember the Saudis, there was some trouble in the eastern part of the country with the Shia population. And the issues of disruption, the Saudis typically will open up the economics of what they generate from oil revenue and bring that largesse to their citizens to keep the cap on things. Well, that can only last so long. That's an issue facing all the countries in the Middle East. If they do not diversify their economies, if they do not find ways to wean themselves off of oil in particular, they have huge political and economic problems that they face. Same thing with Russia. So does Putin use right now ways to take the populace off the issues of economics when you go into Crimea, when you go into the Ukraine, when you go into Syria, when you build that nationalism, when you appeal to their cultural identity? To some degree, yes. And when you look at a country like Russia, I ask myself, how long can they sustain themselves in this type of situation? What was the last product you bought from Russia, made in Russia? I can't think of one. China, yes. Japan, other parts of Europe. But I can't think of a product maybe except the, yeah. So the Russians are facing a crisis in terms of how are they going to deal with this economically. So you start to think about this, and then you overlay this with this vast issue in terms of demographics that are taking place. We've got aging populations in Europe, declining birth rates. China with over 1.2 billion people who would think they have a population problem, but they have the wrong percentage of their population growing older, and they have trouble finding workers. Same thing with Russia. There was an article talking about the Russians having trouble finding skilled workers. These are not minuscule issues. These are problems that are going to be they have to be dealt with. And of course, they have political implications. Then you have the demographics of where is most of the growth taking place? It's in most of the developing nations. The places least prepared to deal with the complications of infrastructure, water, jobs. I mean, we have a political debate taking place right now. Europe is going through the same thing, globalization, global warming. All of this is only going to accelerate in the years to come. So here's what happens. Oil and gas and coal will still be the predominant fuels that we use going forward, 2035, 2040, 2050, any graphs that I look at, anything that comes from the IEA, anybody in the energy industry that you look at shows this as a predominant mix. Alternative energy still grows, solar, hydro, nuclear, wind, biomass, but at least for the next 20, 30, 40 years, we're still going to have to deal with this issue of oil. And that means the political issues and the implications that come from it. So from a policy standpoint, do you think it is beneficial for us to be having that debate? Well, of course, we frame it from the standpoint of global warming. That's how we typically discuss it here. That's how the Europeans, the Chinese, and many others are starting to get on board with this. But from the perspective of how that will change in terms of this energy mix, unless there's something dramatic, and I alluded to that earlier, if you could just have that magic switch flipped, what would happen? But it doesn't happen that quickly. There's massive amounts of capital that have to be invested. One of the issues facing Russia right now from an energy standpoint is the sanctions have had an impact, not so much on the technology side, because we are working with many of the Russian companies. We have agreements with them. The issue is on the financial side. They cannot get the loans from the banks that they need. And it's not just the banks that have agreed not to do business with Russia, but even banks that are not under the sanctions are saying to themselves, I'm not taking the risk. You know, the major banks are not going to be able to deal with them. We're not going to take the risk of lending capital. So the big issue for the Russians going forward within the energy sector is the access to capital, which is not just unique to them, it's a global issue. Then you overlay that with some of the plans the Russians made about where would they be exporting their natural gas in particular. They made some deals with the Chinese. Those deals have not turned out to be as lucrative as they once thought. The Chinese are tough bargainers. They realized the situation the Russians were in, and for any good individual involved in a deal, they said, whoa, you want X, I'm going to give you Y. So the Russians did not get the upfront capital. They did not get some of the contracts that they hoped for. And now, because of the issues with the Ukraine and the Crimea, the Europeans are, of course, questioning the relationships in terms of what they receive from Russia, which is predominantly natural gas. With this fracking revolution that's taken place here and globally, you've seen now excess supply coming to the market in the way of natural gas. Now you also have the advent of what they call LNG, which means liquid natural gas. The United States, for the first time ever, shipped liquid natural gas in a port from Louisiana. Wasn't that long ago that the Japanese, the Koreans, and others were paying $14 to $15, what they call MCF, for liquid natural gas. That price now is down around $7. So the economics of this are constantly changing this game. There is no straight line. And this is one of the difficulties of dealing with economics and politics, is it's a dog's breakfast. If you haven't heard that expression, if you own an animal, put that food down in the morning and then think about where that food's going to be. It's all over the place. So the issues associated with this are very complicated, they're very diverse, and what I am always looking at is what can we do in the United States? We've got advantages here. We've got innovation, technology, very important. We've got court systems that protect private property. The fracking revolution that took place in this country was not on federal land, it was on private land. Nowhere else in the world does this exist. When you look at energy-producing countries, these are state-owned enterprises. And that comes with its own complications and restrictions. American greed, innovation, and technology give us a chance to make money, get out of our way, and see what happens. I know there are issues associated with that, but you have to understand the importance of property rights and court systems that protect these property rights. There are few places in the world that this exists. As a result of this, we've seen this revolution, and it's changed the game. Now, the United States is rich in resources, coal, oil, natural gas. Our debate is, do we continue to use these resources in the manner that we have? We also should be leading the world in solar development. No offense to our Chinese guests that may be here, but China is leading the world in many respects in terms of solar innovation. Many times this is a result of where you put legislative, tax breaks, and various other things that are either economic incentives or economic disincentives. But please understand the importance of a system that exists in this country that few people have the ability to duplicate. I see great opportunity. I'm very optimistic, not pessimistic. But getting back to Russia and the countries that are heavily dependent on oil and gas exports, they are in trouble. Now, they've got reserves in terms of cash that can last for years. So when you hear about the Saudis having to borrow money for the first time, or the Russians having the issues that they're facing at this moment, it's true. But they have also built up massive cash reserves over the last several years when oil is at 70, 80, 90, or $100. But the game will change at some point here, and it will be unexpected. And it will come from places that were out there that we didn't see coming. It always seems to happen that way. It just doesn't drop out of the sky. It's years in the making, and then we all sit and go, hey, how'd that happen? Well, if you're paying attention, you see it coming. So at this point, I just wanted to give kind of an overarching, kind of descriptive of what we're dealing with in terms of demographics, the markets as they exist today, slow growth economically on a global basis, the issues associated with that, low oil prices, which are good for you and I as consumers, not good for these countries that are heavily dependent on this, and then, of course, let our panelists speak to the implications of the political and economic implications of what happens. So at this point, please, I'd like to open this up to questions. Yes.
We need to take one of them.
Yes.
The petroleum situation is actually worse than what you pointed out, because the Deutsche Bank did a study. The Deutsche Bank did a study last year, and they looked at the price that these different single mineral economy countries need to get for health. And so if you take Venezuela, Venezuela needs to take in $160 per barrel for their stability. So you can see why Venezuela is having problems. Russia turned out to be about $100 a barrel, and it's now, what, 30, 35 a barrel. So these countries that depend upon petroleum are really hurting because of what it costs them to, since that's their primary source of revenue. Now, say Saudi Arabia, maybe it only costs $5 or $10 a barrel to pull it out of the ground. We're not talking about that. We're talking about how important the petroleum is to their economies. Thank you. And thank you for your presentations.
He's absolutely spot on, and therein lies the problem for these countries. Prices stay down for a number of years. You're talking about political and social disruption within these countries. Somebody's going to have to cut the subsidies. Pay very close attention in the next several months. Venezuela, as we know it today, will exist, but there's a very good probability you will see a change of government. So an economy is what they refer to as renter economies, is never good economically. Questions, please, on any of the panelists in terms of what they had discussed today.
Okay, I'll just speak loudly. Right here? Did that do it? Okay. Sorry. First of all, thank you all for your fantastic presentations. My head is spinning. And I have a comment for Professor Green. I had some questions, but then Dr. Meyer answered them. But with all due respect, Professor Green, you forgot to mention a couple of additional skills that Putin possesses, his extraordinary black belt karate skills, and his exceptional hockey abilities. So, and yes, and the horseback riding, yes, male model. Professor Key, a comment for you. I have a suggestion that perhaps Prince Charles could get together with President Obama, and Prince Charles could add to his skills. He could learn to do the wave and the tango. Bob, you came up with some, excellent suggestions. But I want to know the starting points of how do we begin to effect these changes. And it seems to me in a way that the West is fiddling while Rome burns, and other actors are coming in and taking over. And I would quickly like to thank you as well, Bob, for pointing out what I consider is the culture of denial in the Obama administration for years now that's, I find personally, very upsetting.
So I'm an unabashed nationalist, maybe not quite in the Putin way, but I'm very, I want to see, because of what I believe we, in terms of our ability to reach out to the world in a positive way.
The microphone must not be on either.
It's not on either.
That one's on.
That's on? Yeah. I want us to lead, not follow. And the question is, what can you do? You start with something simple. What do you do at home? Look at your own energy usage. One of the great ways that we're going to change the equation is through energy efficiency. And you see that happening right now across a whole spectrum of industries where they're looking and saying, how do we use energy, whether it's in the buildings, whether it's for industrial purposes, and there's going to be tremendous innovation and cost savings with what I see going forward in terms of just energy efficiency. And that comes from the cloud, it comes from just a host of innovations that are taking place right now, whether it's the CAFE standards for automobiles, whether it's the efficiency of refrigerators, stoves, hair dryers. We see it across the entire spectrum, even moving from coal that we used to burn, coal to make electricity to natural gas. Reduces carbon, it's not perfect, but it's a step in the right direction. So first, having energy awareness in your own life in terms of what you do, how you use it, and how it has an effect. What we don't want to do is lower our lifestyles that we've become accustomed to. And we don't have to lower those lifestyles to become more energy efficient. And that technology can be exported too, particularly the countries that have the greatest population growth and need. Electric demand is expected to increase dramatically over the next 20, 30 years. Most of that demand is coming from emerging economies. They're starting at such a low base level. The questions they are asking are, what are the energy sources that we are going to derive this electric generation from? Because they have, in many cases, problems with infrastructure. Do they use coal? Do they use oil and gas? We should also be having conversations about nuclear energy in this country. You produce uninterrupted, massive amounts of electric generation with no carbon emissions. I know what the other issues are. But those are conversations that we have to have, and you owe it to yourself to educate yourself about what the different variables are. It can't always come from the experts. It can't always come from Senator Tester. You have just as much ability and intelligence to understand these issues.
So Susan's point, thank you very much for excellent points. If I may, and building on what Bob has already said, I just want to add one more thing. In order to develop policies, solutions, you have to understand the problems. And you have to understand it honestly and directly, and without any of this language culture that we have. Don't say this, oh, he was going to feel offended. No, she's going to, that we need to actually directly tackle the problems as they come to us. I personally, I have to say this, and I will transcend the Republican Democrat. I know everybody is now all thinking about the elections and all that. I go beyond all this, and I will include actually Europe in this discussion from my small little knowledge of it. The West, if we can call it that, lacks leadership, period, beyond ideologies, political parties. And go to Washington, talk to your senators, Democrats, Republicans, congressmen and women. They don't even know this world, sorry. They are living in a balloon, right, which is just kind of floating. They're attacking each other, punching one another, now attacking each other's wives, It's glorious as a show, as entertainment, but it's scary when you have to deal with the complexity of the issues we are facing. When members of the Security Committee in the Congress of the United States tell me that Osama bin Laden is a Shia, they do not even know the difference between Sunni or Shia. They don't even know about Islam. They just repeat what they hear on CNN. And apparently some of them get their foreign policy from CNN. So we are in real trouble. And I think, if I may go back, energy, true, this is true, that is true. The thing that is missing, education, knowledge. Knowledge is power. And when you have an elite which is ignorant, and it's only involved in partisan politics, United States does not have a national foreign policy, right? Because they're over everything. There is such a partisan, heated, personalized, insulting culture. And as long as you have this, United States will be retreating in the world. We have made ourselves a joke in the minds of the world, in the eyes of the world. We have to transcend this. And it's only the educated citizenry which can demand an educated foreign policy, educated environmental policy, educated energy policy. As long as the citizenry enjoy the entertainment, this is what we're going to get.
I have a question. I was puzzled by the Russian withdrawal from Syria recently, because in public he said, Putin said, mission accomplished, and they still keep their base. But is this a contradict to their own the goal of expanding the imperial power? And then it's argued that the U.S. withdrawal create a vacuum. Now he is creating another vacuum. Yeah. And what are we going to do?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I mean I'll just speak very briefly to it and allow my colleagues to speak to it as well. I think I was preparing my remarks and last week or the week before, and then of course Russia pulls out of Syria, so I deleted that file and tried to come up with something else. And I was looking at the Russian press and some of the international press, trying to get some sense of what was motivating this decision on the part of Putin. And I think one of the most compelling interpretations I saw came from an interview in the Jerusalem Post with a retired member of the IDF, and he said, well, basically, Putin has declared mission accomplished, and having never announced what the mission itself was or would be, no one can contradict him on this, right? So it's a rhetorical victory. But as Bob's comments remind us, I mean, all of this sort of rhetorical flourish exists on a very real kind of material base. So what is the nature of Russia's long-term interest in Syria? I mean, I would agree with Mike and Mehrdad. Having that military presence there is very important. Not only for the kind of bluster and braggadocio that it permits Putin to indulge in, but because of the sort of pipeline-related issues and energy-related issues that Mehrdad was referring to.
Yeah, and I also think you have longstanding Russian interests in Syria, geopolitical interests have been preserved. They did achieve Putin did achieve what he wanted to achieve. He stabilized, as I said, not the regime in the sense that it's going to regain most of Syria. It's destabilized the regime in the Alawite part so it'll survive and therefore be able to provide bases for Putin. I think that's really it. And as you pointed out, he's left people there. It would be very easy to ramp up again in case he needs to.
And if I may add, it's a great point. He never set what the goal was for his intervention. So he can call it accomplished, whatever that mission was, at any given time. And he has precisely done that. But if I may add to this, Russian foreign policy is still haunted by Afghanistan. They do not want a long-term commitment and getting bogged down with very high casualties. I mean, that has traumatized the minds of Russian foreign policymakers. And they went into Afghanistan, 79, with the thought that this is a backward country, it's still in Middle Ages, so on and so forth. They didn't realize that Afghanistan was the graveyard of empires. From Alexander to the British, they all suffered as they went through Afghanistan. Afghanistan is an unruly, mountainous, rugged, but a very proud country, and they will fight for their independence. And the Afghans received aid from Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, the CIA, and combined, they managed to actually push the Russians out. That taught the Russians a lesson that they will not forget. Syria is much more complicated and, in fact, much more sophisticated technologically and economically than Afghanistan. That's one thing. The second thing, the Russians have the way I'm reading this also, kind of, we didn't have time to delve deeper into this, and this is very important. And I have to tell you, on this side, I will confess, I actually empathize with Putin, that there is no European or American foreign policy when it comes to Syria. It's improvised on a daily basis. It is changing. It's ever evolving, and so on and so forth. And the idea that we should first get rid of Assad, right? It sounds to Putin and Moscow and many people in the Middle East. I have to tell you, reading various newspapers and journals, it sounds absurd. You have a refugee problem now. You think by overthrowing Assad you will not have a refugee problem. Millions of Syrians who live under the protection of the Assad regime today will be added to the refugee crisis if the Assad regime falls. So his counter-proposal to the United States, and I have to tell you here, he's very rational, in fact. His counter-proposal is, let's get rid of ISIS, let's get rid of the other Islamist organization, and then let's talk about the future of Syria. But you cannot reconstitute the Syrian state by removing its government. Haven't we learned anything from removing Saddam Hussein when Iran collapsed, and we cannot reconstitute it, right? And I have to tell you, I'm still waiting for this administration in Washington to tell me, who are we supporting in Syria? There are apparently an army of 4 people that we spent about $200 million and they gave their guns to ISIS. Is that who we are supporting? See, when Putin looks at all this madness and insanity, he says, for God's sakes, Assad is the best option. And I have to tell you, who agrees with Putin? Read Israeli newspapers, right? The Israelis, the smartest in the region, they're looking at this. Do you want a weakened, known enemy, predictable, with his ragtag army called Assad? Or do you want a Taliban type, Al-Qaeda type, Islamic State next to Golan Heights north of Israel, with unpredictable consequences? And that's why Israelis are enraged by Obama administration foreign policy, because nobody knows who we are supporting, right? Right now, if you really want to keep Syria at least half sane and half together, I would say that Putin's proposal seems far more rational than the proposals I'm hearing from Western capitals. Sorry to disappoint you.
Just want to add something quickly. Before, the Russian population overwhelmingly was against Russia going into Syria with this campaign. But guess what? It's perceived as a success now. And they came back to a hero's welcome. So it just demonstrates how fluid the situation and how dramatic things can change rather quickly. Hero today, goat tomorrow.
If I could get you back to Russia just for a few minutes and their overall aggression. Every time they make a move, our political pundits are quick to propose sanctions on Russia. Now, with the price of oil where it is now, and in your perspective that it's going to stay that way for the next several years, I would think that Russia pulled part of their troops out of Syria because they were spending more money than they needed to spend. But as this goes on, it looks like Russia is, as you said, is in a recession, has been in several recessions, and their economy is slowly collapsing. Putin, I think, is in trouble relative to his own economy and his own people. If the price of oil stays at $35 or $40 a barrel, well under their break-even point, and stays that way for, say, 2 years, how do you think that will play out in terms of Russia's future aggression, future making Russia great again in the Balkans, for example?
Great questions, and yeah, good luck is right. So at the moment, I think, hey, you know, this is good for us as consumers. It's hurting countries that are not our friends. But then I have to think about what this means, and please, my colleagues jump in. If that happened and stayed that way for several years, then what about the potential for, you know, further disruption of their economy, which can lend itself to severe reactionary behavior, reaching out to divert the attention, which has already happened to some degree, to the economic issues by taking people and putting their attention to another issue, stoking the flames of nationalism or culturalism, whatever the case may be. So, you know, ideally, as much as I would like to stick it to them in certain ways, I also have to be very cognizant of what the geopolitical implications of prices staying down for a number of years would be, and what would happen potentially in some of these countries. You could even see more economic and social disruption than we're experiencing right now. And I'd ask, please, Robert and Mike to weigh in on that.
No, I would agree. I mean, I think that if the economic situation declines and deteriorates further as a result of you know, low gas prices for the next 2 years, it's not going to improve the political climate in Russia at all. I mean, there's no, there's clearly a direct correlation between economic instability, economic downturn, and sort of political extremism. I don't think that, you know, a bad economic picture is going to somehow produce stable political outcomes. So I think, in addition to, you know, I would agree with Bob. I mean, what's sort of good for American consumers at the gas pumps in the short term could globally prove to be quite problematic in the long run.
Go ahead.
We have some more questions.
Yeah, so I think rightly we've seen a lot of criticism of American policy, especially surrounding Syria, and there's this notion that maybe Putin took us for a ride. I have a few observations. I think I read an article recently, and it suggested that maybe Assad took Putin for a ride in Syria, and Assad's going to say, all right, Russia, you can pull out, but I'm not coming to the negotiating table because I can rely on Iran whenever I need to. And this really just, my general question is, I mean, I think rightly, doesn't seem like there's a coherent American policy in Syria, but clearly, maybe not all of you, but some of you have opinions on the effects of U.S. power in the region. And what is the end game in Syria? I mean, I think, I'm not meaning to either defend or criticize the Obama admin's position, but Obama has said to others, he said, well, what would you guys do? I mean, now you have Turkey not prepared to accept a Kurdish state. You have Russia not prepared to accept the downfall of Assad. At the same time, ISIS will probably continue to exist as long as Assad exists. The reason the American training effort failed was because everyone wanted to fight Assad. They did not want to fight Daesh. And you had the specific instructions for these CIA-trained and Pentagon-trained volunteers to only fight Daesh or Islamic State, as we call them in the West. So, given these sort of conundrums, I'm curious as to where you see this most recent ceasefire going towards, and how you see Turkey's recent aggression and a lot of this. And of course, it's a long question and it's a huge answer, but anyways, thanks. And thanks all for,
Back next year to answer.
yeah.
I think, first of all, great points, and thank you for the question. I think ISIS, Daesh, exists because everybody wants it to exist. Everybody needs it to exist. And the very forces which pretend to want Daesh to disappear, and they constantly go on their radio stations and TV stations in the region, and they say, oh, we should destroy this terrorist organization. They love it. Let us start with the Iranian regime, right? It's backing the Assad regime against ISIS, correct? It is backing the Iraqi regime in Baghdad against ISIS. It is arming the Kurds in northern Iraq, just like we are, against ISIS. Now, if you take ISIS out, can Iran have so much influence? Of course not. Iran wants ISIS to exist, so the Iraqi regime is dependent on Iran for its survival. So the Kurds will come to Iran on their knees and ask for military support. So the Assad regime will come begging Iran for help. ISIS is God-sent gift from heavens to Iran to expand its influence. So if Iran considers ISIS a threat, it considers it a threat to itself, but it does not consider it as a threat in the region, because as long as the Arab world is fragmented, as long as the Arab world is going through civil war, as long as Iraq is not reconstituted under strong power like Saddam or under an Assad, and they're all coming to Iran begging for support, they love to maintain the existence of ISIS. That's just one example of why leaving it to the regional powers to resolve this. I always hear one of our candidates, Bernie Sanders, says, oh, the regional powers, King Abdullah said, let's get together. Good luck with that one. Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Turkey, and Iran, before they get together to destroy ISIS, they will have a war of their own to resolve their own differences. That is not even in the cards in terms of these regional powers to come together and formulate a united front. Now, I like Bernie Sanders, don't mistake me. He's a nice guy, and I like to listen to his emotional speeches. But in terms of foreign policy, that's a non-starter, in terms of a realistic foreign policy. The reality is nobody has an answer to this situation, and the reality is United States has pulled out of the region. When the Saudis are going to Moscow, right? When the Egyptians are buying arms from the Russians, when Russians can actually build an air base in Syria, it means United States does not have that kind of presence that we used to have. And I am not targeting Obama administration or Bush administration or whatever has happened. What I see right now is that in lowering our dependency on oil from the Middle East, we have changed our fundamental principles of foreign policy. We are not a major player. We are not a major player. That's why our traditional allies are furious with us. Israel is furious, Saudi Arabia is furious, Turkey is furious. And what has happened is the creation of new alliances. Can you imagine? Saudis and Israelis are actually talking because there is no United States to talk through, Washington was always the center to which they came in order to send messages to one another. But now they're talking because they're both concerned about Iran. They're both concerned about the situation in Syria. They're both concerned about Iranian influence in Iraq and Syria, and on an intervention of Iran in Lebanon and among the Palestinians. As long as this situation continues, expect chaos, expect fragmentation. And one thing we have not talked about is that the map of the Middle East as we knew it, especially Arab Middle East, is being redrawn as we speak. This map was fake to begin with. Syria was fake, Lebanon is fake, Jordan is fake, Iraq is fake. These were all creations of the French and British administrations back during the First World War and after First World War. And they're now being redrawn. And I do not think anytime soon you will have a Syrian state reconstituted under an Alawite minority regime anymore. I think Syria has disintegrated. I think Iraq has disintegrated. I think a Kurdish state is emerging right in front of our eyes. We should expect major developments. What worries me is that I have not found anybody in Washington who speaks to these issues while they're slapping each other in the face in front of the camera. And what amazes me and worries me and bothers me is the incredible ignorance of our politicians. Doesn't matter which political party. Sorry, I'm repeating myself on that one.
But my wife is more beautiful than yours.
You need to.
Ladies and gentlemen, out of respect for you, the audience, and the panel, I know we could probably have several more questions, but I'm going to ask for just one more question, please. We'll be available afterwards if you still. I can do it individually. Okay, thank you. Oh, two more questions. All right. Okay. Go ahead, please.
Well, I'm no scholar. I do have a BA, but I'm not really a scholar. All these words of all these countries and all of this stuff is really, really hard to keep track of from my brain. But I've done a lot of looking around on the internet throughout the world, and from what I've seen, basically, if you boil it down to something very simple, it's some countries have something and other countries want what that other country has. Like the Chinese were saying yesterday, well, we know gosh darn well what we want from the Arabs, but the Arabs, they got to figure out what they want from us. Well, okay. But, so basically my point is that it boils down to a bunch of rich folks squabbling over the resources of the world. Basically, I don't care what, I don't care where you're at, that's basically what it boils down to. And what's left, and I also want to say that the bad mouthing of, shall I say, I'm sorry, I didn't mean that as a, but, I'm sorry, I didn't mean that. But I just want to say that I've met this year some of the very most amazing people that I've ever met that are Iranians. And it's very important to separate out the Iranian people from the government. And I just want to ask, are there any Bernie Sanders emerging in these arenas that you're talking about? Is there a people's movement? Well, yes, I know, and I do appreciate you, and I appreciate your passion, all you guys. I do very much. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments.
What was the question?
I don't believe there was a question.
No, there was clearly a question. She was wondering, is throughout these areas of the world, are there people who are interested in looking at the situation from this perspective of people and how you meet people's needs rather than it be more about the resource extraction from each other and who's going to get it with the most amount of power?
Well, very good question. In 2009, from what I remember, millions of Iranians, those Iranian people you're talking about, you're completely right. Very different from their government. 70% below 30 years old, 57% of them women who are educated from colleges and universities. They came to the streets in mass, and they denounced the regime. They demanded democracy, they demanded freedom. And guess what? At the forefront of that movement were hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of highly educated Iranian women. And that was the mass movement which actually inspired to some degree the Arab Spring. Iran not being an Arab country, it actually did have a significant impact on the Arab Spring. And what I remember in this country was, great, they're doing this. And I remember a very brave and courageous Iranian woman by the name of Neda, N-E-D-A, who became the symbol of the democratic movement in Iran, being shot in the heart and collapsing on the asphalt and dying in front of our eyes. And the question in the White House was, did you see Neda? And the answer was yes. And what are you going to do about it? Nothing, it breaks my heart. That was our foreign policy in 2009. I guess the reason it just broke somebody's heart was because we were negotiating secretly for an Iran nuclear deal, and we did not want to undermine that. It's always our economic interest, it's our backdoor negotiations that take upper hand to the values that we constantly teach the world about. Democracy, human rights, and so on and so forth. And that's why, if you talk to the Iranians, I speak to a lot of Iranians on a weekly basis, they tell us Americans speak beautiful words, but they never put action behind their words.
I think you got it. Oh, was it?
Yep, you can go to that one.
Thank you guys for coming in. Professor Key, you spoke about the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Russia and how Prince Bandar, I believe it was, had originally went to Russia with a first proposal. How do you see the United States reacting to a secondary proposal possibly getting accepted, given that the United States is the biggest buyer of Saudi oil? Like, how do you see the foreign policy, or do you see them trying to win back support from Saudi Arabia, or do you see maybe, like you just said, another backdoor negotiation with another high power in the area?
David, great question. Thank you. There are two theories. The first theory was that the Saudi mission to Moscow with the $25 billion, it's kind of, the only way you can call it is a bribe, really. And negotiations about safety, security for Russian investment, long-term Russian interest in the region, was actually something that was devised jointly by the Saudis and United States. But the United States did not want to put itself up front, so it was actually Saudis who carried the fire, carried the proposal. So that was one theory. The other theory was the Saudis were so sick and tired of the inaction of the administration in Washington that they just took it upon themselves to carry the foreign policy and see what they can get. We do not have access to internal documents to tell you which theory is more correct, but what is very correct is that this Saudi regime is furious with Washington, and it has repeatedly said so, it has expressed it. And there are concrete reasons. These are not personal reasons, this is not dislike for individuals. The first reason is that they believe US foreign policy, starting with the Bush administration, by the way, was wrong-headed. Why? Because getting rid of Taliban and Saddam Hussein, especially Saddam Hussein, the Saudis could care less about Afghanistan, but especially in the case of Saddam Hussein, would expand Iranian influence and bring a Shia Iranian-backed regime in Iraq next door to Saudi Arabia. And that would allow the so-called Iranian Shia arc, right? Starts from Central Asia, Afghanistan, Iran, and it goes to Iraq and Syria, and then through Syria to Lebanon. And Iran now is emerging as kind of India or China of the Middle East. That's how the Saudis. So their argument was Saddam Hussein is evil, he's brutal, he's bloodthirsty, but you're breaking the glass, you will own it, and the result would be chaos and Iranian influence expanding. Guess what? The Turks warned on the same basis. Do not remove him. Punish him. Contain him, impose embargo, but do not remove him. You remove him, Iraq is not a country, is not a nation, it will fall apart. And I think their prediction was absolutely correct. So that's one area that was the tension. The second tension was, do not then withdraw so quickly, because the Arab world especially sees this as two extremes. We went and overthrew Saddam, right? That was one extreme. The other extreme was, well, let's get out, without building Iraq or preparing an Iraqi army which can maintain order and security. The third grievance, which was very, very heavily aired by the Saudis, was the Iran nuclear deal. That is, you cannot contain Iran. Iran is merely signing this deal to get the billions of dollars by the frozen assets which will be released. In the end, it will actually help Iran build its military capacity to a level that no Arab country can match it. And Israelis were saying basically the same thing. That's where the Saudis and the Israelis came together in opposing the Iran nuclear deal, and the Obama administration was pushing. So at that point, the divergence was such that the Saudis basically saying there is no real alliance between us. If our security and our long-term concerns are no concern to Washington, and Washington has its own agenda, we might as well negotiate with Moscow separately. We might as well have an independent foreign policy. That's as far as I can share with you. At least that's as far as what documents show why they are furious with the administration in Washington.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all who came out today. Thank you.
Thank you.